So for those of you who don't know, I have my mother's last name and not my father's. Now, this sometimes created confusion about my parents. And some people would assume that since we don't share the same last name, my dad must actually be my stepdad. It was so weird, in fact, that a picture of my family was featured on the front page of the LA Times View section in a story about unconventional names. But in many cultures, the idea that identity would be passed down through the mother isn't weird at all. The modern-day Muso people of the Himalayas, the Tuareg people of North Africa, the Akan people of West Africa, the Minang people of Indonesia, over 100 million people belonging to various ethnic groups in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, and in Judaism, all of them in different ways trace their descent through the mother and not the father. I mean, heck, even the super masculine Spartans of ancient Greece did it. And here on this continent, Turtle Island, matrilineal descent is recognized by the Hopi, the Lenape, and the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. What's weird is that we even think it's weird. But in this country, and in much of the Christian world, really, we are so caught up in this patriarchal worldview where men are understood to be the dominant sex that we can't wrap our heads around the fact that it could be any other way. My grandmother, my dad's mother, was so incensed with the name change that despite me being the oldest Salwasser grandson, when my grandfather died, she passed on the Salwasser family ring to my younger cousin instead of me, because he had the Salwasser name. But who's better? Of course, queer couples have had to figure out what they'll do with their own names after getting married for as long as they've been joining in partnership and now in marriage. And as with Gail and Marjorie's story of developing their own expectations around household tasks, there is no tradition to default to. Do you hyphenate? Do you keep your own name? Do you both take the name of one person, the one that sounds nicer, or do you come up with an entirely new name that's just a mashup of the two names? For me, there's a wonderful freedom and beauty in this process of what I would call queering the culture. Picking what works for you, rejecting what doesn't, and creating something that is authentic to you in the process. Even for me, despite being in a heterosexual relationship, identifying as a bisexual has given me a sense of freedom to be authentic to myself that I know many straight men don't feel. And you don't actually have to be queer to do it, though. Anyone can subvert gender roles. I know several heterosexual couples who have merged their last names into a new name. And there are other ways to do it. My dad, too, really wanted to be more nurturing than the average dad of the 1980s. He was even planning on being a stay-at-home dad for a year when I was a toddler until my mom's pregnancy with my sister prevented that from happening. And now I'm so glad that now that he's retired, he's just thrilled to be able to take one day a week to just spend that time with his granddaughter in a way that he couldn't with his kids. And so I'm grateful for that. And I'm so grateful that these gender roles are being questioned and dismantled. Before our child was born, we picked the name River because it was the name that would work regardless of the biological sex or gender. And I have to admit that I wasn't thrilled when she started developing a love for, quote, girly clothes. But when one morning she started saying something like she couldn't wear something because it was for boys and that pink was a girl's color, well, I made a beeline for my closet and got on my pink button-up shirt and said, look, Daddy is wearing a pink shirt and he's a boy. And so thankfully we were able to move through that stage. And now she loves wearing both her pink Minnie Mouse shoes and her blue Mickey Mouse shoes. Of course, there's still that insidious corporate brainwashing, but you've got to pick your battles. And yet to some people, that subverting of, quote, traditional gender roles and traditional family values is a threat that could undermine the very fabric of society. That's why the presidential administration is considering a policy that would erase transgender, genderqueer, and intersex people by creating a legal definition of sex as a biological, immutable condition determined only by genitalia at birth. In effect, this would undermine all the protections for transgender people under Title IX, despite being out of line with numerous court decisions. And it would also require us to ignore the understanding of the American medical community, which recognizes that there is a distinction between sex, which are based on bodily markers, and gender, which are socially constructed roles and behaviors typically ascribed to men and women. And also recognizes that one's internal sense of their gender may not, in fact, match the sex assigned to them at birth. And I think the right is doing this because they see that attempts to question and reject rigid gender roles are dangerous for our society. They see the recognition of trans and genderqueer people as a threat to the social order. To quote two beloved pieces of pop culture, cats and dogs living together, mass hysteria. Won't somebody please think of the children? But here's the thing. They're not wrong. We do want to upend the patriarchal social order because frankly, it's enough. Many have come to realize that these rigid gender roles are not only stifling but actively harmful. They are harmful to girls who are taught to be demure and risk being labeled as a bitch or worse when they claim their authority. Who are taught that their dreams and careers and ambitions may have to take a backseat to their husband. Who are taught that they can't be sexual without being labeled a slut. Who bear a disproportionate burden of household work and child-rearing, even when they work full-time, even in couples who say they want equality in the relationship, and I'm sure is rightly taking note of what I am saying right now. We undervalue, quote, women's work. Even those who are paid to do that work are paid less than so many other jobs, earning just 78 cents on the dollar compared to men, a number which is even worse for women of color. Women's jobs as secretary and waitresses, who are often vulnerable to sexual harassment, or domestic workers like maids and nannies who often have minimal protection or job security, and even professional jobs like teachers are chronically underpaid in this country. Well, we hear the argument, well, it's a job that you love, or it's not that challenging. Ha! So, you shouldn't have to be paid as much. The work is the reward. Trust me, if there's a strike, I'll be out there with you. Yes. I don't want that for my daughter or any other girl. And although we don't plan on having any more kids, I wouldn't want any son to internalize the harmful messages that the patriarchy teaches boys too. That they can't cry or feel sad without being labeled a sissy. That problems can be solved through violence. That they aren't supposed to be gentle or nurturing, that isn't manly. That they are supposed to be sexual aggressors. I don't want a society where we don't believe women when they tell their stories of sexual harassment and assault, or when they are made to feel like it is somehow their fault, or asked, why didn't you report it when it happened? We never heard any real questioning why countless men abused by Catholic priests for so many years didn't come forward for decades. But when a woman does it, it's suspect. And I don't want a society where we can elect a president who was caught on tape bragging about sexually assaulting women. Even though he lost the popular vote, a majority of white women voted for an avowed sexual assaulter. What does that say about our country? What does that say about how our society values women? What message does that send to our young girls? What lessons does that teach our boys? That sexual harassment is okay? That it's just something that women and girls have to deal with? And that wound was reopened a month ago when All but one Republican senators voted to confirm a man who faced credible allegations of sexual assault. And a majority of Republicans said they thought Kavanaugh should be confirmed regardless of whether or not he sexually assaulted her. Because boys will be boys after all. Or things were different back then. But a righteous indignation has been released in our culture. And now some perpetrators, including powerful men who previously seemed untouchable, are facing repercussions for their actions. Losing their jobs, losing respect, sometimes even facing jail time. And with the Me Too movement, I remain cautiously optimistic that we are in the middle of a much-needed cultural shift, where people move towards practicing consent, and we believe the survivors and hold perpetrators accountable. I'm so grateful to the 256 women who are running for Congress, and the countless others who are running for state and local races. But of course, even in the all but impossible event that all of those races were won by women, still less than 45% of Congress would be women. And we still have a ways to go because of people like Mark Harris, who is running for Congress in North Carolina. You may have heard about him in the news. He's a former evangelical preacher who just a few years ago preached to his congregation that God instructs all Christian wives to submit to their husbands. You're not to ever submit, ma'am, because your husband demands it, he preaches, but you do it because the Lord ordained it. Now, ladies, you can rebel against that command, but just please understand, you're not rebelling against your husband. ... In another sermon, Harris lamented that women aren't learning skills anymore, like how to prepare a meal, or how to sew a button, or how to keep a home. And he even questioned if women pursuing careers and being independent was a healthy pursuit for society. Now, although Harris's comments are on the more extreme ends of things that a politician has said on tape this year, it no doubt reflects the views of millions of Americans, and not just men. And sadly, there is a good chance that he will be elected this year. So how are we here almost 100 years after women won the right to vote? How have we not come further? Of course, I think Christianity has been part of the answer. A religion that for many centuries has been controlled and defined by men whose scriptures codified patriarchy as God's will. I'm proud that Unitarian Universalism is the only religious denomination with more female clergy than men, although the Reformed Judaism and several mainline Protestant congregations are catching up. But I can't help but note that this shift in women's ordination coincided also with a cultural shift to embrace goddess and earth-centered spirituality within Unitarian Universalism. I don't think that is a coincidence. But it's not really about the scriptures either. They've always been a convenient excuse to maintain an unequal social order for those who benefited most from that inequality. If the foundations of our society were shaken up, those at the top, those with the power, would be in danger of losing it. And although the forms of oppression and dominance have changed form over the centuries, that underlying issue of dominance remains that way to this day. The patriarchy has never been solely about subjugating women. It has always been more complicated than that. Carol Christ, a feminist theologian and scholar, defines patriarchy as a system of male dominance rooted in the ethos of war, which legitimates violence, sanctified by religious symbols in which men dominate women through the control of female sexuality with the intent of passing property to male heirs, and in which men who are heroes of war are told to kill men and are permitted to rape women, to seize land and treasures, to exploit resources, and to own or otherwise dominate conquered people. Maybe there were times in human history where strong patriarchal societies served a purpose. I can't help but say that in some ways it paid to be violent and aggressive when there was another tribe threatening your land or with whom you were in competition for limited resources. That doesn't necessarily make it okay, but it makes it understandable at least. But over time, that social order became calcified, whether it served any beneficial purpose or not, because it maintained men's power, something that they didn't want to give up. But there are always two matriarchal societies, as well as other cultures that tend to share equality more equally, that have always existed, most often in areas where resources were more plentiful, and thus groups didn't have to compete with each other as much. In most modern societies, though, our basic needs are taken care of. There is enough food to feed the world. What we have is a distribution problem. There is no reason for anyone to go hungry. We have enough to meet our basic needs. We only continue this pattern of domination, of subjugating people of different genders and sexual orientations, people of different countries, in order to maintain that power, exploiting people, going to war, wasting countless lives and resources just so a few might be able to hold on to that power. Now, I'm not sure that more women being elected will be able to put an end to the rapaciousness and exploitation of our American government. But as a whole, I have more faith in their ability to make a difference. When women are promoting laws like universal preschool, which would help women return to work more easily after having kids, or paid family or parental leave, which wouldn't just benefit working mothers, but their children, their spouses, would it help everybody? And that's really the society, what we're moving towards. It's not a society where women dominate men. That's never been what matriarchal societies have been about. Matriarchal societies have been egalitarian. Sharing wealth, sharing resources, sharing power, sharing decision-making. And I think it is incumbent upon us to model that in our relationships with each other, to model that within our community, to model that out in the wider world. Then, might we see the change that we so dearly hope for. May it be so.